Hello, this is the podcast from the international research platform SIMM, with reports and interviews from across the world on the role music can play in social and community programs. I am Lucas Perron. During this 8th episode of the SIMM-podcast, you will hear me interview 3 fine scholars from the Southern Hemisphere. Natalia Puerta Gordillo and Juan Sebastian Rojas from Colombia, and also Tinashe Mutero from Zimbabwe. I discuss with them about research on social and community music projects in the Global South, research developed by local scholars, as well as by researchers from the North. They all 3 attended one of the 4-day seminars SIMM has been organizing, allowing small groups of scholars to share their research experiences and methodologies, and thereby developing an international research network in this field. Hearing them makes one wonder whether we shouldn't stop thinking of our world as composed of only 2 blocks, North and South, and instead let ourselves be inspired by Arturo Escobar's recent presentation of our world as multiversal, composed of a multiversity of realities and perspectives. Juan Sebastian Rojas is working as a postdoc for the Bogota Juan Corpas University, teaching at the Universidad El Bosque, and active as a researcher on SIMM practice in Colombia. Juan Sebastian is also working on the international comparative research, which is studying what makes musicians want to be involved in social music projects in Colombia, the UK, Belgium, and Finland. Juan Sebastian is presenting his research at the 5th Symposium on the 2nd of March. You can find a recording of it online. So Juan, I'm really happy you're part of this podcast episode, and so I can talk with you about what's going on in Colombia. And so, first of all, I think my impression is reading so much coming from your country in terms of practice and research on the practice, that there's a lot going on in the field of music playing a role in social and community work.
Yes, Lucas. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It is an honor to be here talking with you tonight. And yes, definitely, Colombia is a place in which you can see a noticeable increase in research and practice and policy, related to music as a mechanism that can produce different kinds of social impact. And this is very interesting because I don't think it has always been like that, but I think maybe it is related to the multicultural shift in Colombian policy. We had this constitutional reform in 1991 that basically changed the entire vision and structure of the nation from a modern nation, which you would basically understand as a very homogeneous nation, or the way it was thought of, right? As one race, one religion, one language, all these sort of monolithic views, into a more like multicultural and ethnically diverse nation. And along with that came a lot of policy changes. Some of those policy changes acknowledge, for example, the role of culture and art in the construction of the nation, including many times the cultural expressions of ethnic groups and, ethnic minorities, including indigenous groups, Afro-Colombian population, and other kinds of Caribbean population along the nation. And I think this also came hand in hand with this idea of, you can see it as an utilitarian approach, in the midst of a process of transitioning to a neoliberal model, of the national economy. But it used the arts basically as a way to start and introduce and evolve a new incarnation of the music industries. So a cultural industry that is related to music. So there were many changes that led to music being conceived as a social force in the last, I would say, 30 years, more or less.
But the governments can propose this, but then it was clearly also adopted by many people on the ground and developed. Many different practices were being developed, so adopted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. But I guess in a way it's policy also acknowledging what was already happening, right? So people were already doing a lot of this kind of work, and now just a framework, an institutional framework comes about that organizes it, or frames it into the plans of government. And that makes it stronger sometimes. So, of course, there's very important cases, national cases, but you can see different kinds, but big cases such as the National Music Plan, which was sponsored by the Ministry of Culture and that was modeled somehow along the lines of El Sistema, the famous Venezuelan model, but not completely, because this had a very strong component of traditional music schools, and it actually managed to cover all municipalities of Colombia had one of these school bands, and many times they were very oriented towards satisfying local needs. But this program was so big that you could not control every single school, so a lot of them were function from a different, less communal kind of environment, where the idea was to produce a band that would win prizes at the regional or national contest instead of, something that would maybe entail or focus the attention on maybe more social aspects,
Research in Colombia has been developing too in this field. Research done by Colombian researchers like yourself. But I see also that people from outside come to Colombia and to study these realities. How does that work? Is there close collaboration with people from outside coming in and doing research? What does that mean in terms of opportunities, but also in terms of difficulties, maybe?
Mm-hmm. That is a great question. Thank you for asking. Because, if this podcast is about the Global South or relations with the Global South, if we say Global South, we're implying a Global North. So that already implies a set of relationships, which we know, and this comes from post-colonial theory, that have been very mediated by the history of colonialism. And that is very, very present in academia and research as well. So I think to answer your question, what I see right now is more and more collaboration. Myself and other colleagues are part of international collaboration projects that pertain to this very issue, collaborating, for example, the Music for Social Impact project that hosted at Guildhall School of Music in London, that we are collaborating with colleagues from Belgium, Finland, and Colombia. Yes. So I think, yes, there are definitely more efforts towards collaboration, but I feel that one thing that is important, for example, when researchers from outside come to study these kinds of situations in Colombia, is to take into account local scholarship, because we have a long tradition of people thinking about these issues. We have a long tradition of people thinking about the social impact of social research. Social research has a long-standing emancipatory tradition here in Latin America that started around the 1960s with scholars such as Orlando Falsborda in Colombia or Paulo Freire in Brazil, and others that contributed to this larger narrative about a post-colonial science, a science that was made by the people and for the people. In this tradition that, granted, hasn't always been in dialogue with a more, let's say, less applied tradition of scholarship, sometimes because of the language, sometimes because of political, institutional issues related to research, I believe that there is now a lot of scholarship being produced that can be an asset to better communicate, to create a better mechanisms for scholarly communication in between different hemispheres. The same way, when I did my PhD in a US university, I had to read a lot of scholars from the global north. I think it is also just fair to get to know the scholarly traditions of the global south if you are going to do work there and collaborate with scholars there.
Which are research topics, questions that you think should be looked at more carefully?
maybe musical diversity. Colombia is such a musically rich country, where people resonate with so many different kinds of sonorities. But the most programs and the largest programs focus on Western classical music, which is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing because Western classical music, is very technical. It has a lot of advantages, in terms of training. But it's sometimes, if you're thinking about social impact, it may not always be the best tool to develop these kinds of projects. So I think maybe a more open, a more diverse perception of what music is, basically a more open view about music. Music is not just that tradition. Music exists in so many different ways. Some indigenous groups don't even have a word for music, yet they practice complex and very diverse styles of what we would consider music. So what is music in the end? It always depends on who you're interacting with. So these universal standards of aesthetics, I think, should be reevaluated if your main goal is to, have social impact through music.
What are good examples of sharing your research findings with people on the ground, developing the practice, the musicians, the facilitator?
I think the best way is to collaborate, to try and, of course, you can share your findings, and you can, for example, do that by sharing an article, by maybe having some kind of seminar with them and discussing the findings and, having these kinds of discussions with them. But you can also, for example, invite them to write a paper with you, or to present with you, that way, you're giving voice to someone that is a direct practitioner, and you are maybe, completing that perspective with your own as a researcher. And that might also spark, further collaborations and ways of reflection and things like that. So if you cannot invite yourself to the activities of your facilitators, so you cannot be like, I'm going to just share my research results by doing this with you. But you can invite them to your activities. If I am a scholar and I, have access to certain platforms and certain spaces, for them to say it in their own words, maybe I can do that, and I can frame that so that, it's still research, not because somebody that doesn't have a PhD is addressing a scholarly audience doesn't mean that it's not, a scholarly process.
Doing research in this field, do you need to be a musician?
Ooh, no, I don't think so. Actually, no. I am a musician, and I feel maybe sometimes we are very arrogant about it, and we feel that we have something that others don't. And certainly, we do have something that someone that is not a musician may not have, but others also have things that we don't. I have met people here in Colombia that chair great NGOs and do a lot of very important socially impactful music making activities at a regional level, with hundreds of people, and they are not musicians themselves, but they are able to just create a context in which, and organizers, they are administrators, cultural workers, sensitive, maybe not artists themselves, but sensitive people that can make it work, can oil the machine and make it happen.
Yeah. And as a researcher, it's the same. To understand what you study, even though you study musical projects, you don't need to be a musician. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
I think so. It depends on what you're looking for, right? If you're trying to study, how the different drum parts interact and, what's the relationship between the different meters, then maybe you need some musical technical abilities to do that. But if what you are trying to look at is something else, you definitely can. Music is much more than the sound. Again, it depends on what you're looking for, right? It depends on what your question is. I think there are many ways of doing research and doing, the thing. But again, if you're trying to do some socially impactful, activity, you don't need to know the music itself, but you may need to know the social context in which you are working, Maybe it's not as symmetrical. Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. I had never thought about that.
Natalia Puerta Gordillo is PhD candidate in the SIMM-PhD program at the London-based Guildhall School of Music. Her research is on social music programs back home in Colombia. Natalia is presenting her ongoing research at the 5th Symposium on the 9th of March. You can find the recording of this online. Hello, Natalia.
Hi, Lucas.
So glad that you can talk with me about Colombia and about SIMM practice and research in Colombia. And it's a field which is in Colombia developing enormously, no?
Yes, my impression about the development of the field is that it's growing. I feel that there is a greater awareness of the role of music in the transformation of social and human realities here, and particularly, for example, in the state role. The governments or the state have started to implement initiatives and at local, regional, and national. And there are some national initiatives that maybe Juan Sebastian are going to share about, for example, from decades now in Batuta, like they have been working for training in orchestra practice for to vulnerable population, programs like Red de Escuelas de Música de Medellín, which is
which has been studied by Jeffrey Baker, no?
Exactly. These are state local programs that are through music tackling issues about citizenship and social transformation also. But lately, for example, the Philharmonic Orchestra of Bogota, which is also a state program, started to train musicians of the orchestra that are working with public schools in music education projects on issues about social transformation, because there is a starting like an awareness that musicians by itself, they don't have necessarily the training to
do like outreach work. Yeah,
exactly. So in a way, they started to implement these diploma courses for musicians to talk about issues about context, issues about social inclusion, to examine the pedagogies. Because yes, these musicians came from conservatoires and they don't have this kind of pedagogic mind to develop these programs.
And there are many musicians interested in these propositions?
I think it's growing. Yes, it's growing because in one way, some of them doesn't have the pedagogical training. They know how to train instrumentally,
yes,
how to play an instrument, how to do ensembles.
People who want to come to a music school or conservatory who want to master an instrument and a repertoire. Yes,
exactly. But there is a big issue here. I'm not about how actually through music making or through music pedagogy, you can actually put in place all these kind of aspects of how you manage the human relationships or this content about social transformation. So I think this awareness is translated in the increase of training programs for musicians in orchestras, also in the universities, lately in the National University, which is a very important university here in Colombia, launched a course, a diploma course in music and peace construction or peace building. And yes, some of the universities also are started to open research lines in arts and training for peace, for example, or the Gloria Zapata's work with UNESCO program for education and culture for peace in Corpus University, or in Medellin, the University EAFIT, they have like a research line about community music and social function of music for post-conflict in Colombia. So there is a growing mass of critic thinking about what is the role of music, in not only an academy or the state, but also on artists as an activist.
So you're yourself doing research in this field in Colombia. You're preparing a PhD in London. and so you're in between Colombia and the UK. And I would like to find out what that means for you. So to be in connection with your own country, Colombia, and to learn from people in the UK, and to be in connection with what in the global north is being developed in this field.
Yeah. I think it's an incredible position to be. It's very challenging because you have to understand the different panoramas, different motivations, different institutional structures around social impact. I mean, in my specific study, which is related to development, I had to understand very well these two sides of the world and to do this kind of cultural translation. I mean, here we don't talk too much about social impact. We talk more about social transformation. I feel there is a gap between, of course, the way we produce knowledge at universities and producing papers and academic research, and the motivations for producing knowledge of these communities and social movements and leaders. They don't want to necessarily produce papers. They want to strengthen their own practices and have the possibilities to understand better what they do and to do it better. Mm-hmm. So I think when research, if we open more the concept of research and the methodologies to produce knowledge, we will facilitate the participation of these communities of practices on the production of knowledge. For example, there is a collective nature of knowledge production in music in these practices. So there is not one researcher producing knowledge, but a community. So we have to ask ourselves what kind of methodologies we can implement. For example, we can encourage participatory action research. So the people there knows how to make questions to their own practices and how that questions strengthen their role. There is this idea of systematization of experiences, that there is a method here in Latin America that is much more about the people that is inside the practices systematize their own experience. And for example, to promote methodologies like practice as research, or research, we call it here research creation, like creating music and arts as a way of doing research, of producing knowledge. Of course, it composes like questions about how to do it. I mean, there is, of course, protocols. But I think if we expand the ways we do research, we can expand also the products of the research and how that products are appropriated by the communities. And for example, this podcast and videos, performing, this kind of products that involves more the orality of the practices and are more appropriate for people to circulate knowledge and to appropriate knowledge better. So I think we have this kind of epistemological challenge to open up research a bit more, to collaborate more with practitioners and musicians, and to do more agreements, institutional agreements to do that.
Tinashe Mutero is postdoc researcher from Zimbabwe, who is developing his research in South Africa in connection with the Durban University of Technology. Tinashe has a specific interest in studying the role music may have in social and community programs in his region. So Tinashe, you're doing research in the field of music, in social and community work, and the impact of music in this field. And you're in Durban, South Africa. You're not on your own. You have a series of colleagues also developing research in this field. You've been able to be part of a SIMM seminar, thanks to the sponsoring of SEMPRE. But it's not necessarily so easy for people from your country, African countries in general, to develop these connections with people doing research up north in the global north. I would like you to give your ideas about this.
the opportunity to have connections with researchers from across the globe is not really easy, especially for young researchers, because it might have been easy for our seniors who had their education in the West, so they had colleagues that they can probably work with. But for us, the young researchers, they are students who have always been studying here. It means our connections are also researchers from within our locale.
Is your impression that the practice of social projects are developing in your region?
The practice, yes, is always developing, but unsustainable. And
in which sense?
These young people also need food, and music is not necessarily a career that is paying this side. Of course, we do have huge artists, but they then move on to other things with their life.
Yeah, so they stop.
But that does not, they stop.
Can you give some examples of projects?
I'm from Zimbabwe, so I will start from SIMM. Mostly in Zimbabwe, when we are doing the same kind of practices, they come from community-based arts organizations. So these community-based arts organizations, essentially they start with recruiting young people who are in the community and teach them music with the idea that it takes them away from drugs, takes them away from all the other vices. The biggest ones would be in Blawa, we've got IASA, we've got Amakosi. From where I come from in Gweru, we've got Perfect Works, we've got IRA. In Harare, we've got Chenaka, we've got Chipawo. These are all organizations who use mostly traditional music for social impact, particularly targeting the young people.
When I hear you, it seems like in Zimbabwe there's a lot going on in the field of social music projects.
Yeah, so there is quite a lot going on. Unfortunately, there is very little research. So there is practice.
Yes.
But the research side is weak. Partly because there's no funding for research, but the practice is strong because in our communities, as you might know, music is just a social activity that we just do.
Yeah, it's somehow per definition a social activity.
Yes, you see. So there isn't much that you need, but for sustainability, that you have this group of youth coming in, going. That's where the challenge is.
You did your PhD in Durban University, and are you now back in Zimbabwe or are you still in South Africa?
I'm now a permanent resident of South Africa. Yeah. So I'm in Durban, working at the University of KwaZulu-Natal.
And also, are you preparing new research?
So I wanted to do something with immigrants, to find ways to improve on social inclusion of immigrants in South Africa using music, but also to find ways of social cohesion.
And immigrants in Durban, they're coming from where? From Mozambique, from Nigeria, from where?
So we've got immigrants from Zimbabwe.
From Zimbabwe,
Mozambique. We've got Swaziland a bit because the language is similar. They easily fit in. We've got Nigerians.
Yeah.
We've got immigrants from the DRC Congo.
Congo, yeah.
Yes.
That's my country. I mean, it's not my country, but that's where I did my research, yes.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of Congolese people coming to Durban. I always say to friends, South Africa is the USA of Africa. We've got a lot of immigrants coming in because the economy is quite strong. In one way, I believe one way of starting positive dialogues is to appreciate people's cultures, and music is a good entry point into doing. That's something that I want to work on.
But this is a field really, really interesting. It's a field which is interesting a lot of researchers in many different countries. So it would be really of great interest, I know, that researchers in very different other situations would be able to follow your work and your research. So I hope that the SIMM platform can be a meaningful platform for you as well to share your research experiences and findings. Do you have experiences with people from other countries coming to South Africa to develop research together with you or with some of your colleagues?
I was at SIMM in 2019. I met a lot of interesting people. One of them being Dave Camelin from the Royal College. So with Dave, we decided, I actually wrote to him that I wanted to do a research on migrants, social inclusion of migrants through music. And I think, while SIMM is a platform for sharing these researches and for the connection, for me was important. It did not been for SIMM platform, I wouldn't have met Dev. But I also think if I had met him through his writing, there would be a difference between introducing myself that I read your work and I'm interested. Through those 4 days, I knew Dev, the person, and I'm sure you also knew Tinashe, the person. And that's how these collaborations come about. So it's a very important platform where you learn what others are doing. You also share your experiences.
Tinashe, what do you expect from collaborating with Dave Camelin from the Royal College of Music in London? What could be collaboration with somebody from such a different background? Would he be coming to Durban? Would you be going to London? Or isn't that at all the project?
So the project was supposed to be done in South Africa.
Uh-huh.
So, primarily for me, I think Dave is very rich in the theory and his methods are very good. I would love to do something where it's really well grounded in theory, but also it's measurable. You can say this is evidence-based. So that's what I wanted to benefit from him, something which is rigorous, scholarly. And I assume that you would also learn one or two things from what I know.
During this podcast episode, you heard interviews with Natalia Puerta Gordillo and Juan Sebastian Rojas from Colombia, and also Tinashe Mutero from Zimbabwe. You can find more information about them and about some of the projects they refer to in the text you will find with this episode. SIMM is the initiative of scholars and practitioners from 7 different countries and 4 different continents who felt the growing need to find ways to bring together people interested in developing research on the possible role music can play in social and community music programs. Sound engineer and co-editor of this episode of the SIMM podcast is musician Mariusz Radwanski. Please visit our website at simm-platform.eu.